Figure it out.
Hello, this is Adam Koralik with Flying and Eating. Today, let's go somewhere and do something, and make sure to like, comment, and subscribe.
Hey everyone, it's Adam here, and welcome to my American Presidential Library series. I am currently in my hometown of Chicago, Illinois, and behind me is the future site of President Barack Obama's Presidential Library. This site, which at the time I'm recording this, is set to open sometime later next year in 2025, so obviously that could kind of change. But I thought, in anticipation of this happening, it would be fun to go to all the previously existing presidential libraries, of which there are 13. This will be the 14th. We will do them in continuity order by seniority of president, and we'll just talk all about them. They are kind of a rare thing, kind of spaced throughout the country, and as this series goes, you'll learn more and more about each one of these presidents. We begin our presidential library adventure here in West Branch, Iowa, home of the presidential library of the 31st President of the United States, Herbert Hoover. This museum is debatably the first one, only because Herbert Hoover is the senior most president to have a presidential library. However, he did not actually create the first one. This is kind of a little bit of a side story here, but the first one is either debated between him, FDR, and Harry Truman. The reason for that is that when Herbert Hoover left office, he had no intention of making a library. It really wasn't a concept yet. FDR, while he was president, was something of a hoarder and a collector, and he had basically started building one, not for public consumption reasons, but just because he wanted a place to put all of his stuff, which would eventually get mutated into a library. However, the first president that actually decided we should have a post-presidency library was Harry Truman. Retroactively, that idea, which was FDR's, became a library, and because Herbert Hoover lived to be 90 years old, this dude died in 1964. He died after Kennedy. He lived a lot longer than most people think. He decided, I'm going to have a presidential library too. So in terms of seniority order, this is where the adventure begins.
So when you walk through, they have this cool presidential seal. They have information on other presidential libraries and sites. But inside, this is your entryway. We have full standouts of Herbert Hoover and Lou, his wife, and just a whole bunch of plaques and things. There's an auditorium here where there's going to be some sort of video we can watch and everything. I guess that happens every couple of hours. Yeah, there's a lot of stuff down there. And then over here, you have admissions. And of course, the most important thing in anything like this, the gift shop. So this is really cool. The presidential libraries have this thing called a passport. They can be a little hard to find. I went to the Jimmy Carter one once and they had none of these in stock. But basically, if you go inside, they have information on all the libraries, where they all are. Each president then has one. It's kind of hard to do this with one hand. But if you see there, you see with the locations of all of them and in the seniority order in which they exist. So as I mentioned before, Herbert Hoover was the 31st president of the United States. So even though his library was not built first, this one was finished in 1962, only 2 years before he died. This is the senior most president with a library. So they also give you a stamp for every one of these. But if you go to, future libraries, like when I eventually go to the FDR one in New York, I'll get a stamp there. And you might be wondering, like, how far does this go? The most recent one that they have in here is George W. Bush, because the Obama one is not completed. However, they do have pages, if I can get to it, for future presidents, which would be like right here. So the Obama one will be there, and then Trump will be there at some point, I'm sure, Biden over here, et cetera, et cetera. So after you get in your tickets and everything, this is the first thing you're greeted to. Where do you want to start? You want to start? That's the exit, so I guess we wouldn't start there. No flash photography, but don't worry, we're not doing that. I guess we'll start here, because they just did his 150th birthday celebration. I guess you could have made a birthday card. There's a film about Herbert Hoover's birthday. I kind of like that old-timey, listen to that. That's kind of cool. So yeah, this is him at 86 in 1960. That's when the museum started construction, was in 1960. But yeah, so this museum was completed in 1962. But yeah, this section is very much, the Chicago Boys Club. Is that us, the Chicago Boys?
We made it.
I guess I don't remember us doing this, but I guess that was us. Yeah. Yeah. No, we didn't do that, obviously. But yeah, very cool. So just a bunch of stuff to celebrate his birthday and in various years and all that. I think that's cute. So when you first enter, you'll also see this thing on the ground. It's like a map of the world, and it basically has this quote, and it's talking about Herbert Hoover. And then it has like these little markers on the floor. These little coins, if you will. They have like little, what looks like wheat almost. These would be various places that Herbert Hoover was involved with in some sort of humanitarian capacity. You guys need to understand, Herbert Hoover was a very interesting guy prior to his presidency. You know, like, well, we'll see some of it here. He came from, obviously, West Branch, Iowa, where we are at the moment. Came from a farm town. His logic, you know, grow stuff and help people, feed people, etc. And I'm sure it'll talk more about this, but you know, one of the things that he was best known for is that he was a philanthropist. He was very successful financially, and he would eventually go on during the First World War. You know, Belgium in particular was starving due to the German invasion, and the United States was neutral at the time, and he found ways to get around both British trying to block the Americans from getting into mainland Europe, as well as the Germans trying to block Americans from getting into mainland Europe. And that's why they have a Belgian flag there, actually. And he was able to cut a deal with both sides to just feed the people. And that's what they're talking about here, the Great War, aka World War I. And he came out of World War I looking like this unbelievable saint who just had saved millions of people's lives in Europe. And that's what a lot of these photos are for. So he was kind of known as being a very good logistician who was very good at feeding people in mass. And he became one of the only politicians after World War I who came out looking a lot better than the other ones who had entered it. But yeah, here it was like a big thing about how he had mostly saved Western Europe, at least in the very physical sense, you know, from dying. And I think these people will be kind of eternally grateful for him. And a lot of people would just had a lot of appreciation for Herbert Hoover's skills pre-presidency. So there's this whole bit here about how he went to China early on, and he was trying to help them build ports, and basically the Chinese were kind of anti-Western at the time, and they mostly kicked him out. But a lot of bad news came from that. There was also, I don't know if they're going to have a thing about it. I'm sure they will. But before the activities of World War I, when the war broke out in London specifically, there was like some 120,000 Americans trapped in London, and they weren't the British weren't allowing Americans to leave anymore. And Herbert Hoover was working in London at the time. So again, great logistician. He figured out how to find food and supplies for all the Americans over there. So basically, he had really upped his credibility with the United States, with the American people, as well as a whole bunch of European countries. He just looked like this amazing person, and he really was. He was very good at all this kind of thing. Very much, again, kind of like a Jimmy Carter. He just liked to really organize and help people. But those skills wouldn't necessarily translate to the presidency. Yeah, so this dude was also all over the map, even though the Soviet Union then at the time was considered, you know, communist and not necessarily a friendly country. He actually did the same thing for them. They had a bunch of starvation problems, and he would organize, you know, activities to make sure people were eating. And he basically said something to the effect of like, you know, I don't hear that like 20 million communists are starving. I hear 20 million people are starving. You know, man of the people type of logic. Some sort of, this is weird. They made a mold of his face at some point. That's actually kind of creepy. Yeah, look at that. So then along comes the 1920s, the Roaring 20s. Hoover, of course, was involved first, broadcast television in 1927. You have all these things like popular music and sports, literature, obviously Steamboat Willie, which now public domain, by the way. Charlie Chaplin, all that kind of stuff. What's interesting is all the way back in 1920, though, the story goes that both the Democratic Party and Republican Party were both approaching Herbert Hoover to attempt to get him to run for the presidency. Because they thought he was the perfect guy. In fact, it was, ironically enough, FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the guy who would eventually replace him, who was really trying to convince him. And in some people's minds, FDR thought he himself was not electable, but that Hoover was, and that he could run as his running mate to kind of wedge himself into an eventual presidency, which was extremely ironic considering where everything goes. Yeah, then history goes on. Warren G. Harding ends up president. He dies only a couple years into his presidency in 1923, if memory serves. And then he is taken over by Calvin Coolidge, who completed his term and then ran for a second term and won. Could have run for a third, chose not to. And at that point, Herbert Hoover was up to bat. So in this section, you see bits about what he called the Child's Bill of Rights, which is kind of fascinating. I didn't know this. His parents both died before he was 10, and that made him very sympathetic to a lot of people and a lot of children. But he was Secretary of Commerce under both Harding and Coolidge, and they always thought of him as kind of a weird one because he had decided firmly he was on the Republican ticket, and Republicans typically do not believe in the idea of government intervention. He kind of did and kind of didn't, so he was a little bit of a loose cannon in that regard. But while he was Secretary of Commerce, he decided to kind of use that power to wield a lot of regulations. So like this might sound really basic to us now, but things like traffic lights, that was kind of Herbert Hoover during his time as Secretary of Commerce, not as president. He was just very much a glue guy, a good logistician again, but not necessarily the best politician. But I could see why everybody thought he would translate well to the presidency. So over here, they talk about the Hoover Dam. This was very early on into his presidency, before the Great Depression actually started. So the Hoover Dam, which still, of course, stands to this day out near Vegas between the Nevada and Arizona border, started construction, as it says, on June 25th, 1929. And it sort of started. Officially, construction started in 1931 because obviously a big logistical problem. And to this day, it stands as it created Lake Mead, and the water generation that comes through there creates electricity. To this day, Las Vegas is powered by this thing. This is one of the most sophisticated and insane technological achievements in human history, and we kind of gloss over the fact that Herbert Hoover really was kind of responsible for it. And fun little fact, by the way, if there ever I'm telling you this too, if there's ever a zombie apocalypse, where you want to get to is Las Vegas. And the reason you want to get to Las Vegas is because it is estimated that if humans just suddenly all went away, zombies, whatever it is, all like our power grids, everything would start to fail within like 72 hours, with one exception, and that's Las Vegas, because all of its power is provided by the natural course of water just flowing through it. And this thing could theoretically continue to be powered for like 10,000 years without human intervention. So again, zombie apocalypse, where are you going?
Las Vegas.
That's right.
Get eaten while having the lights
Yeah,
on.
that is the one thing you've learned in this video. Good. In the UK, when you vacuum something, it's referred to as hoovering. Apparently, at one time in the US, that used to be the expression as well because of the vacuum company Hoover. However, apparently post Herbert Hoover's presidency, people didn't want to refer to that as hoovering. They wanted to refer to it as something else. So that's like where apparently an idiom difference just went off and branched out. Don't know if that's true, but that's an interesting story nonetheless. So this was a big deal. In 1927, there was a flood of the Mississippi River. This would have been the equivalency of like Hurricane Katrina back then. However, the government really didn't have any sort of infrastructure for this kind of thing. And again, as we mentioned before, it's typically on the conservative or Republican side, which is who was in power at the time, Calvin Coolidge. There was no necessarily government structure to deal with a crisis like this. So Herbert Hoover, again, philanthropist, humanitarian, and technically in some position of power, decided, I'm just going to deal with this. So he went out and he did a big logistical thing trying to save people's lives and, feed them and all that sort of stuff. Again, all these accomplishments together, it really seemed like he was a good guy who could handle a crisis no matter what that crisis was. And thus that led to the election of 1928. So he ends up winning the 1928 election in a massive electoral landslide, and they have a nice recreation of his basically speech podium here. It is inauguration speech. They've got that set up, which is very cool. But the thing with Herbert Hoover is that he was really the right guy for the 1920s and the Roaring '20s mentality. He was not the right guy for this, the stock market crash, which he is largely associated with. But it wasn't really his fault. The stock market crash was a coupling of a bunch of different factors. One of them actually was not his fault, but it was something he may have in a weird way contributed to, which was the Roaring '20s created a lot of new technological innovation, right? You see like new tractors and farm equipment and all that stuff. Because of that, because farming culture had been so prevalent throughout the United States. Again, where we are right now, this ground was a farm a century ago. Everybody was a farmer. Like everybody was a farmer. But you did that because it took that much effort to create that much food. But with technological innovation, suddenly everybody could produce food super easy. That actually caused food to be so prevalent that prices crashed. And that contributed partially to this, along with just Wall Street being completely divorced from reality, everybody borrowing like crazy. That leads to the stock market crash in October of 1929, only like half a year into Hoover's presidency. And suddenly he's dealt with this sort of crisis. Now, this is where, ironically, his philanthropist philosophy of like the rich man do right, the rich man help, really fought against him, because it was a lot of rich people suffering, but also the richest of the rich were also the ones that were going to weather it just fine. It was was the poorest of the poor who were suffering. But because he personally believed government should not intervene in this type of thing, it meant he is the government, so he himself cannot do this. So he kept waiting for rich people effectively to do it. He did do little piecemeal type of things, but mostly was trying to encourage people to take it up and pick themselves up by their bootstraps, if you will, and fix it, which was just the wrong policy at the wrong time. But of course, all these factors contributed and created the Great Depression, which is unfairly blamed on Hoover. It was not his fault. This would have happened without him. He unfortunately was just kind of the wrong guy. His philosophy was just kind of the wrong guy to actually deal with it, but he was the obvious face of it. And so that's why you got people saying like Hoover's Poor Tobacco Fund, and eventually there would be these entire like shanty towns made out of like garbage people were living in, and those were called Hoovervilles. It just like, it's like nature just didn't want this either. There was also the time the dust storm was happening around there, so you couldn't grow crops and everything. There was the big banking crisis. In a nutshell, the way the banks worked at the time was like, let's say, for argument's sake, that you had $20 and you wanted to deposit it into your bank because you only needed $5 right now. So you took, your 5 with you and you're like, all right, the other 15's in my bank. The bank realizes you probably aren't coming back for that $15 anytime soon. So we're going to loan it over to Bob over there. He's going to take your $15. And that way, on paper, you still have $15 if you come back. Bob took that money though. So when the depression, the crash happens and you went back for your other $15, like, sorry, we don't actually have it. We gave it to Bob because we thought he'd return it before you needed it. That in a nutshell is what happened to everybody. So one of the other big debacles was the bonus army incident. So this is kind of a fascinating story. There was a whole bunch of World War I veterans, Great War veterans at the time, because World War II hadn't happened yet, who were entitled to financial bonuses in 1945. But they're all like, I may not even live to 1945 because at this point, I need this money now. So a whole bunch of army vets basically stormed on Washington in a protest, as you can see photos there, basically demanding to be paid early. And Hoover was like, I don't know what to do. So he delegated to Douglas MacArthur, a future famous World War II general, to deal with it. And Douglas MacArthur's idea of dealing with it was basically just to go to war with people. He started shooting at people, arresting people en masse. It was like this big violent thing. So from the American perspective, it looked to the public like Hoover not only didn't care about this, he was willing to use the army to destroy people who were literally war vets who had protected the country just because he didn't want to deal with your problems. It just looked so bad, even though privately Hoover clearly did not actually believe that. Again, we have to remind you, this was a guy who would go out of his way to film or feed millions of people. I don't see a section on it because he did have some accomplishments, so he doesn't get enough credit for those, but mostly he's remembered for a lot of the bad things that happened. Another one that happened, which was really unfortunate, is so one of the things he did to attempt to police the inflation problems and all the depression issues was that he was trying to get people to buy American, which makes sense. He thought that would help the American people. So he created these really high tariffs on foreign imports. Basically, if, we were kind of talking about this a little bit before, but Americans, imagine you got a car. There's a Ford, one's, like a Fiat, or, just different foreign cars. They basically said, we're banning all the foreign ones, and you can only have the American local stuff. The problem with that is that there just wasn't enough competition anymore. So if you were the local store who could only sell American things, that meant that everybody could jack up all the prices to whatever they wanted because they had no competition. And that actually made the problem infinitely worse. Yeah, Hoover smart guy, kind of the wrong guy at the wrong time. He didn't really seem to grasp the entire extremity of the problem, or the extreme nature of the problem, I guess I should say. And he made some decisions that unfortunately just made it worse, which was really too bad because he, in a lot of ways, was really set up as the dude who could do this better than anybody. This one's actually more personal to him and I. We appreciate this one. One of the things he did do is he created some tools, if you will, to make it easy for Al Capone to ultimately get arrested and help clean up Chicago, which was gangster-ridden at the time. So thanks, Hoover. We appreciate you. So just beyond that whole area, we have this, which is more about his wife, First Lady Lou Henry. Lou Henry Hoover, and just like her life, and just kind of told in the story some probably original outfits she had. I don't know if this is kind of built on what used to be part of. No, this is clearly fake. Never mind. There's a little film in there and everything, but it's just kind of cool to see a little bit about one of the former first ladies. So, to shock to nobody, he ends up losing the 1932 election to FDR, and FDR is inaugurated on March 4th, 1933. Back then, it wasn't January 20th, it was March 4th. They basically had a 5-month lame duck period as opposed to the 3-month one that we have now. Now, apparently, what's interesting, I mentioned FDR earlier, they were actually really good friends to the point where at some point FDR, it's rumored, had tried to eye himself up as a potential VP for Hoover back in as early as 1920. But by this point, they really weren't in conjunction anymore. So FDR really ran on this campaign of like hope, and I'm actually going to change everything. I'm going to enact all these policies, et cetera. And I guess during that lame duck session of 5 months, Hoover tried to work with FDR multiple times and have them be on the same page policy-wise, because he thought that would be good. And FDR really wanted nothing to do with him, because at that point, Hoover was so stunningly unpopular that he's like, if I tie myself to him in any official capacity, that's just going to bite me forever. And apparently, after this infamous car ride, there's footage of this where Hoover just looks so depressed, whereas FDR just looks so full of optimism, which became very symbolic. Hence, it's even represented here on this New Yorker article, obviously in satirical fashion, but not far from the truth. It became so iconically associated with that it was just amazing, and it, oddly enough, works totally in history. And then after that, the two, apparently they never spoke in this car ride, not even once. FDR at one point pointed at some building and said something like, "Good steel," or something to that effect. Hoover never responded, and the two men never spoke again for the rest of their lives. Of course, FDR would eventually die in office in 1945, and Hoover would end up outliving him all the way to 1964. So as you just pointed out, reading this, there is some truth to the idea that the reason FDR didn't want to talk to him is because anything that was going to be bad that was going to happen, he didn't want to be associated with. And sure enough, during that lame duck session, February 28th, 1933, only a few days or so really before FDR would take over, there was another crisis with the banks. And because Hoover was still technically in power, he was completely blamed for it. So like he was crazy unpopular by the time he was out of there. However, he did have a much more successful post-presidency. He kind of went back to a lot of his philanthropy work. He didn't really like being, of course, associated with the whole like Hooverville, meaning, depression and being just blamed for everything. He would eventually find peace back in the White House. He was brought back to the White House, I think, during the Truman years. And he was invited in to be, kind of an associate, an affiliate who would work somewhat with Truman and everything on that. This stuff, I'm not sure what any of this is. I assume it's just items they once owned. So a little bit more about that Truman-Hoover meeting. This is obviously a photo of them. Basically, it goes on to explain that the war was wrapping up. It was May 1945. At that point, Truman was in office, and they were preparing for having to repair Europe. And Truman invited Hoover because, A, he was the only living former president. At that point, FDR was dead, and all previous ones were long since dead. And he also had a history of repairing Europe. So Hoover actually had some impact on things like the Marshall Plan and all that to repair Europe. But again, much like Jimmy Carter, a lot of his greatest accomplishments were his post-presidency and are often kind of forgotten. At least Jimmy Carter had the advantage that he lived in the more modern age with better access to media, where Hoover just did not have that benefit. So this is the Waldorf Towers in New York. Hoover moved into it apparently in December of 1940. This is the actual key to his apartment at the time. And they have like a recreation of what his apartment looked like over here. And that was his primary desk. And he, of course, had a presidential flag and all this sort of stuff. But yeah, he spent a lot of time working in his actual suite, just doing a lot of post-presidency stuff. Like he was not one of those post-presidents who just went into that good night just playing golf. Like the dude actually did a lot of work, basically the kind of stuff he had done before he was president. Here we have an actual chunk of the Berlin Wall. Of course, Herbert Hoover was very much, like any American president, was very much against communism and the wall. And I'm sure he did a lot of efforts, I know, to get food into Berlin as part of that whole process. Here, that's him meeting with Richard Nixon, Truman, Eisenhower, other presidents. He was a very active post-president. I can't express this enough. The dude lived until 1964. He lived a very long time. He outlived John F. Kennedy. I mean, granted, Kennedy would have lived longer were it not for obvious historical unfortunateness. But and then here's just a picture of him fishing. He was also a big avid fisher, and I believe he did that like right around here somewhere. But in a nutshell, everybody, that is the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library from beginning to end. They have a bit about here, of course, his death. He died in 1964, as I just said, and that was only 2 years after this place was completed. And he died in New York. They took his body out to D.C., where he was just kind of taken around, and then he was brought here to West Branch, Iowa, for burial. So after you leave the library, you'll also notice that this is actually where Herbert Hoover is buried. So his gravesite is up there. We're going to go take a look at that. They have two ways to get there. I guess this is a slower way to get there, but it's a little more, flat. Whereas you can actually see there's a bit of an incline here, and so you have to walk up there. So yeah, we're going to go do that. But while I show you that, keep in mind this area is it's pretty big. And like the library's down out there, they have a lot of parking, and obviously this whole town, West Branch, Iowa, like to be completely real, this place is mostly known for the fact that Herbert Hoover is here. So not surprisingly, a lot of stuff is named after him, and a lot of sites are all about him. This is where the more accessible, like I guess you would say or you would probably say wheelchair compatible incline comes in, and they both lead up to the same point, which is pretty cool. And here he is, Herbert Hoover, 31st President of the United States. His remains next to his wife. He actually survived her by 20 years. Herbert Hoover was one of the senior-most presidents we ever had. He died at 90, almost beat the record held by John Adams as the oldest living president, a record which would eventually be beaten by a few different presidents. I think Reagan did it, and now currently at the time I record this, Jimmy Carter is the oldest president in American history. As a bonus, the Sega Pluto has now visited the grave of Herbert Hoover, because, why not? So we're now leaving this area. Obviously, the bodies are over there, the remains of Herbert Hoover, 31st President of the United States. His childhood home is apparently like right over there, so we're going to go show you that as a little bit of a bonus. It's also very hot out, so I apologize for how these two large men are just sweating in your face constantly. So if you're out here and you're a little confused, we're going to go over to the childhood home, which appears to be that one right there. They have this map outside the presidential library. We are here, and we're going to go up to Birthplace Cottage. But they also have these, like I guess he had a friend's house or something. Like this whole area, not surprisingly, is very decked out to him specifically. It kind of reminds me of how Plains, Georgia is basically half Jimmy Carter town. Out here, it's a lot of farmland and stuff. I mean, Hoover, I think, originally was something of a farmer president from what I recall. He's very similar to Jimmy Carter in a lot of ways. I would say he was like the prelude to Jimmy Carter. He was this guy who was a nice guy, very much a philanthropist, kind of did all the right stuff, and then was just kind of bogged down with a crisis that he couldn't really handle. And he was better known as a post-president than an actual president. But and much like Carter, if you guys saw, I did a Jimmy Carter video once where we went down to Plains and everything. Very similar. Like they kind of set the whole town up to kind of look like it did. And they had his childhood home and all that sort of stuff. But I'm pretty sure that's where we're going. So this is a little house they called the Friend Meeting House, or the Meeting House, that exists right outside of it looks like the Birthplace Cottage over there. And he would spend a lot of time in here, and I guess this is where a lot of his, they say, Quaker values came from. FYI, you can totally go inside here, very echoey and everything, but yeah, it's still set up. I wouldn't attempt to sit or anything. It's not the most exciting of buildings, but the fact that you can go in, it's kind of cool, don't you think? So this is it. This is the Birthplace Cottage of Herbert Hoover. I mean, this really goes back. We were kind of talking about this on the drive out here, because we actually had to drive through Dixon, which is where Reagan was born. And we're like, these guys were old enough. They weren't born in hospitals. They were born in like these tiny kind of cabins and stuff, which is neat. But yeah, we're going to go ahead and take a quick look at it. So we are inside the Birthplace Cottage, as they say, tight and cozy. I mean, this is tiny. So I guess presumably this was the bedroom they slept in. Maybe he slept in here at some point. But yeah, this is the humble beginnings of the 31st President of the United States, Herbert Hoover. And here's their exit, very small. To be fair, there's also this little storage room off the side of the house, but yeah, what does it make you think, just being this tiny little house, that an American president came from this? Kind of cool.
It's definitely a sign of a different era where people didn't have a lot of stuff. This was all you needed.
Yeah, and you would just go outside and like work on the farm. I mean, keep in mind, this was all like part of the farm and stuff that they would have had. Obviously, there was a local blacksmith and everything. I don't pretend to be a huge expert on the history of Herbert Hoover's childhood or anything, but all the same, very cool to see it. And again, you can do this anytime you want. If you're an American, get out to West Branch and check out one of the earliest presidential libraries. Like I said, the senior-most presidential library of any American president. And also, this is one he actually had something to do with. He was involved in the creation of his own library, which is cool. Where are they going to the bathroom?
Here's your outhouse. Don't worry, they were prepared for that. Do you want to use it? Do you need it?
No, I'm good.
Yeah, I'm not.
It would explain all the flies everywhere.
He's right, there are flies everywhere.
I didn't even introduce him. This is Snowman, by the way, in my Discord. You can hang out with him. He's a really cool guy. If you like video games, especially if you're in Chicago, this is a dude to talk to. So, I have to ask you, did you have any fun? He drove me out here. It was really nice of him to do. Did you learn anything? What was your experience like? What can you tell the people about the 31st President of the United States, Herbert Hoover?
Yeah, it was kind of fun. There was a few interesting things that I learned about, especially the philanthropy stuff. So, it's pretty much all it was, though. It was just, that was like what I took away, was he was like a genuine great human being, but kind of a terrible politician.
Yeah, that's pretty much it. He was, in a lot of ways, like we've said it multiple times now, he was kind of an interesting, almost precursor to a Jimmy Carter. I would say Jimmy Carter was better in both being president and post-president, but this guy was kind of similar in that vein of presidents. But yeah, it's very cool. So if you're out ever in West Branch, Iowa, go to the Herbert Hoover Museum. I'm not even sure you have a choice if you actually go to West Branch, because pretty much all it's there. But yeah, hopefully you guys like this video and you look forward to the next one, which should be FDR, because I want to do these in, presidential order. That one's out in New York somewhere, so at some point that'll happen. But yeah, stay tuned for that. And obviously, in the meantime, if you could do me a favor, please like this video, comment down below, subscribe if you've never done that before. Check out all the social media stuff in the description: Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, Discord, where you can also hang out with him, Patreon, Spreadshirt. I appreciate the support on those platforms. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you all later.
Adios.